Welcome to Liberty Park Music's Composer Bio series. In this video, we'll look at the life and music of American composer Scott Joplin, who's primarily remembered for music like this. This tune, Joplin's The Entertainer, has been heard in television shows, commercials, movies, and has even been used as a melody broadcast from ice cream trucks. In the 1970s, The Entertainer topped the Billboard Hot 100 charts at number 3, more than 50 years after the death of its composer. In this video, we're going to briefly introduce the life, world, and music of Scott Joplin, and show how his music crossed between popular and classical classifications, resulting in a lasting impact on the musical world. Scott Joplin was born in the American South in 1867. Shortly after the end of the United States Civil War. The product of a formerly enslaved father and a freeborn mother, Joplin spent his first years in the town of Texarkana on the border between Texas and Arkansas. His parents were his first music teachers, and in his later childhood years he took lessons with local teachers. Despite emancipation, life was still difficult for African Americans. Opportunities for paid work were limited, and discrimination, segregation, and racial violence remained commonplace. The life of performance offered one avenue for occupation, as minstrel and vaudeville shows were among the most popular musical entertainments in the United States during the late 1800s. Such entertainments consisted of musical performances, speeches, and skits, which frequently depicted negative stereotypes of African Americans, Native Americans, women suffragists, and immigrants. Despite their content, however, these shows provided an opportunity for many African Americans, including a young Scott Joplin. In the early 1890s, Joplin worked as an itinerant musician, touring with dance bands and singing groups. His Texas Medley Quartet may have even performed at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. In the later 1890s, Joplin settled for a while in Sedalia, Missouri, where he took music classes at George R. Smith College, a historically black college. Many HBCUs were founded after the Civil War to help educate newly freed African Americans, many of which were still denied the right to an education. Joplin also mentored younger composers, directed stage productions, and worked as a pianist, performing in the bars and brothels of Sedalia. It was in Sedalia that Joplin began publishing the music for which he would become most well known, ragtime. Ragtime music had been around for a while, but was mostly an improvised style that emphasized syncopation, which is a rhythm where beats other than the strong beats are accented, creating ragged time. Many music scholars believe the ragtime style of syncopations was influenced by Afro and Afro-American rhythms. In the late 1890s, with the publication of sheet music for compositions like Joplin's, ragtime rose to prominence. It was considered a highly popular style of American music through the 1910s, when it was ultimately overtaken by jazz. At the time, many critics lamented that ragtime was corrupting the minds and morals of young people, and often heard criticism of new styles of popular music throughout the ages. In 1899, Joplin published what would become the first major ragtime hit, Maple Leaf Rag, the piece which would earn him the title of the King of Ragtime. This publication is notable not only for the popularity of the composition, but also for the publishing contract that went with it. Typically, composers of the time sold the rights of their music to publishers for a lump sum. However, with Maple Leaf Rag, publisher John Stark and Joplin worked out a deal where Joplin would earn royalties for each copy of the sheet music sold. This publication deal, along with the popularity of Maple Leaf Rag, ensured Joplin a steady income for the rest of his life. Today, this royalties system of earning is how many musicians make money off publications and recordings. They earn a small percentage for each play or sale. In the early 1900s, Joplin moved around the American Midwest, working in Sedalia, St. Louis, and Chicago. During this time, Joplin focused more on composing and teaching rather than performing. Joplin's first opera, A Guest of Honor, toured briefly but was never published, and the score is lost. Scholars believe A Guest of Honor told the story of Booker T. Washington's visit to the White House and then-President Theodore Roosevelt, a highly controversial event with white Americans at the time. In 1904, Joplin composed a rag for the St. Louis World's Fair entitled The Cascades, named after the cascading fountain built for the fair. Joplin's publications continued to sell, but none were as popular as the Maple Leaf Rag. In 1907, Joplin moved to New York City, where he focused on composing and producing his second opera, Treemonisha. Treemonisha centers on a young, educated black woman named Treemonisha, who uplifts her community through her education. As with his previous opera, Joplin composed both the text and music for Treemonisha. The opera was self-published by Joplin in 1911, but Joplin was never able to see a fully fledged stage version due to the lack of support from financial backers, who did not believe an opera by a black composer about a black subject matter would be successful. Its premiere finally came in 1972, and it was later revived and performed on Broadway. Treemonisha received a Pulitzer Prize in 1976, and Joplin was the subject of a commemorative postage stamp in 1983. Joplin married 3 times. The first marriage dissolved after the couple lost their child. Joplin's second wife died less than a year into their marriage, and Joplin was survived by his third wife, Lottie Stokes Joplin. In the final years of his life, Joplin suffered from illness and delusions caused by syphilis. Joplin died in New York in 1917 and was buried in a communal grave. Joplin wrote ballads, songs, band arrangements, 2 operas, and at least 53 solo piano pieces, many of which were rags. While Joplin most likely improvised rags during his live performances, he wanted the ones he published to be taken seriously and performed them as he wrote them. Joplin's biographer, Edward Berlin, writes that Joplin's rags are notable for their melodically interesting inner voices, consistent and logical voice leading, subtle structural relationships, and rich chromatic harmonies supported by strongly directed bass lines. Joplin's ragtime compositions influenced many later popular music styles, including jazz. His desire to have his music taken seriously as art fit with some of the philosophies of the Harlem Renaissance and later popular music advocates. Pieces like Maple Leaf Rag were absorbed into the jazz tradition and even used to accompany films as early as the 1930s. Wider attention was brought to ragtime and Scott Joplin during a ragtime revival in the 1960s, during which Joplin's music began to be recognized not as popular music, but as classical music, worthy of serious study. Since then, Joplin has been the subject of numerous recordings, biographies, and even a feature film. Though Joplin was considered the king of ragtime and one of the best-selling composers of his time, he was left out of many music history books up until the revival in the 1960s. Today, he is considered among the great American composers. Thanks for watching. For more music history videos and articles, stay tuned to Liberty Park Music. And keep an eye out for further entries to our Composer Bio series, in which we'll explore the lives and music of your favorite classical composers.